This is the first and introductory session of Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes University. We'll be publishing subsequent sessions periodically, hopefully more frequently than once per month. And I'd like to give you some background why I qualified to conduct this service. When I was 12 years old, I developed diabetes. We had no way of knowing our blood sugars except if we went to a hospital or a doctor's office and were prepared to wait 1 to 3 hours to get a result. They would do a venipuncture to get blood from your vein, and you'd then sit around and wait to know your blood sugar at that point in time. In an effort to get a rough idea of our blood sugars, we would test our urine with a liquid that we had to heat over an alcohol lamp. Some people used a Bunsen burner, which was a gas flame. This just told us how much glucose was in the urine. And since the urine glucose can be 3 hours or more behind the blood glucose, we never knew what our blood sugar was at a given point in time. The net result was that you could be anywhere from 0 to 1500 and not know it. There was lots of hypoglycemia, severe hypoglycemia. During one of my unconscious episodes from hypoglycemia, I was convulsing. I developed many of the long-term complications of diabetes. It wasn't such long-term, it was early on. When I was about 15 years old, I developed what's now called gastroparesis. In those days, it had no name. It's a paralysis of the stomach wherein your digestion, stomach emptying, is greatly slowed down. I had severe burning, retrosternal burning that's in my chest after every meal, and frequently all day long. I used to eat about 2 bottles of Rolaids per week. That was 200 tablets a week in an effort to control the burning. It helped a little, it didn't help a lot. So it was a pretty painful situation. I was also bloated and belching after meals. I developed night blindness, which meant that in the old days we had movie theaters and instead of television sets. And if I walked into a movie theater, I had to sit in the back row for about a half an hour before I could see the rest of the theater to find a seat further down near the screen. That's one of many complications. I had a lot of trouble with my teeth. I had infections that were hard to heal, took a lot of antibiotics for all kinds of problems. When I had a cardiac stress test, it was found that I had cardiomyopathy, which is actually a microvascular disease of the heart that comes with that diabetics experience. It leads to weak ventricular contraction. I'm trying to think what other problem. Oh, yes. I had 4+ protein in my urine every time I peed. I didn't discover this until I was about 30 years old. At that time, we were able to purchase dipsticks to find out if you had protein in the urine. And every time I urinated, I had maximum protein, which means at least 1,500 milligrams per day, which is pretty advanced kidney disease. when I was old enough to be employed, I had the misfortune, I guess, of working for employers who were not as smart as I was. And most of the time, I would behave myself. But if my blood sugar were too low, I couldn't tolerate people who were in charge making mistakes. So I would yell at my boss. And of course, whoever my boss was at the time didn't like it. And I would get into trouble because of the hypoglycemia. I didn't know my blood sugar was too low. They didn't know it was too low. We had no way of knowing. I was trained as an engineer and worked for about 20 years as an engineer or as a business executive. One of the companies, I only worked for 2 companies, and one of the companies I worked for manufactured medical laboratory equipment. I spotted in one of their trade journals an advertisement for a meter that was being sold to emergency rooms to tell the blood sugar, to tell the doctors in the emergency room whether a patient were diabetic or drunk. If someone came in unconscious at night when the labs were closed, was he drunk or was he diabetic? Those are the 2 most common causes of unconsciousness. And this would tell them in 1 minute by measuring a finger stick blood sugar in 1 minute. So I said to myself, gee, I'm an engineer. If I knew what my blood sugars were, maybe I could do something about it. Maybe I could avoid these hypoglycemic attacks. And that would make life a lot easier for my family. So they wouldn't sell me a meter. But my wife was a physician. I had put her through medical school. And I used her stationery, with her permission, to order my first blood sugar meter at a cost of $650. Now this was back in 1969, so that would be several $1,000s today in terms of equivalent money. Anyway, I bought this meter. I'll show it to you. Just 1 second. Here it is. It weighs 3 pounds, and I, being an engineer, put a jack in the back for a battery connection. And what I did was I took 2 Radio Shack 9-volt batteries, wired them in series to theoretically give 18 volts, but in reality they only gave 12 volts, which was just enough for this meter. So I would carry this meter around with me in a shoulder bag, and I was able to conduct experiments to help me figure out what was going on. Well, the first thing I wanted to know was how much would 1 unit of insulin, remember I had to take insulin to stay alive, I'm a type 1 diabetic, how much would 1 unit of insulin lower my blood sugar? Another question, how much would 1 gram of carbohydrate raise my blood sugar? And with that information, I started measuring blood sugars many times during the day, see what was going on. And what I observed was that my biggest blood sugar increase was after lunch. And lunch was my highest carbohydrate meal. So I rapidly learned that there was no way to control my blood sugars with the high carbohydrate that I was eating. I neglected to mention that I was one of the first people in the country put on a high carbohydrate diet because of the fear in those days that dietary fats would raise your cholesterol, and that in turn would cause heart disease. And diabetics were dying like flies of congestive heart failure. We now know a lot differently. We now know that the heart disease in diabetics is caused by high blood sugars. We know that the heart disease in non-diabetics is usually caused by inflammation, and that the markers of inflammation are not cholesterol and fat-related substances, but inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, lipoprotein small a, and so on. Well, with all these measurements, I learned a number of things that were very important. The most important of those was that even small amounts of rapidly acting carbohydrate would send me very high and faster than insulin could lower it. So I couldn't take a shot of insulin before a meal and expect to prevent a blood sugar rise. I couldn't take it a half an hour before a meal or an hour before a meal to prevent a blood sugar rise. The food just worked faster than insulin. So it didn't take a long time to learn that I had to greatly restrict the carbohydrate in my diet. And eventually I was able to keep my blood sugars essentially normal around the clock, and certainly eliminated the severe hypoglycemia, much to the relief of my family. I neglected to say that on weekends when I was home, I would be working around the house or on our boat, and prior to the existence of a blood sugar meter, I'd be running low every weekend and impossible to deal with. I tried to convince my doctor that he should be doing this with all his patients. I tried so hard with him because he was president of the American Diabetes Association. And he said, what are you trying to do? You're going to put me out of business. My patients come to see me once a month for a blood sugar. If they did it themselves, I'd have no patients. And of course, what did he do for them if they came in with a high blood sugar or a low blood sugar? They didn't know what to do. So the president of the American Diabetes Association was against me. I wrote up the method I had worked out for keeping blood sugars normal around the clock, which is now called basal bolus insulin dosing. And I tried to get it published. At the same time, doctors were criticizing me, because I was approaching a lot of doctors, that there was no value in normal blood sugars, even though research with animals showed that you could reverse the kidney disease that I had by keeping their blood sugars normal. I finally did 2 studies at 2 university hospitals, Rockefeller University and at New York Downstate University, where we had about 15 people in each group, all type 1 diabetics, and taught them how to normalize their blood sugars. And we actually were able to reverse early complications of diabetes, such as leakage of proteins into the vitreous humor of the eye, which we were able to measure with sophisticated equipment, and several other things. But doctors kept saying, you're going to drive these people crazy, they'll be severely depressed. Well, in advance, we took in a psychiatrist at one study and a psychologist at the other study, and they both administered the Hamilton Depression Test, and we tested both groups. Both came through as severely depressed before the study. By the end of the study, when they knew how to control their blood sugars, the score was normal. They were no longer depressed. And when you interviewed them to find out why they were no longer depressed, they all gave the same answer. And they frequently used the same words. I'm now captain of my own ship. I'm not getting random blood sugars hitting me out of the blue. I don't know where they're coming from. I now know what my blood sugar is, and I can make it what I want it to be. So that was a big accomplishment. While these studies were being performed, I tried to get the method published. It was rejected by every medical journal I submitted it to, with some pretty stupid statements, like no one in his right mind would let an electrical device tell him how to treat his diabetes. That was the Journal of the American Medical Association. The editor of the New England Journal of Medicine said there's no evidence that there's any value to normalizing blood sugars, and so on. I figured that one of the reasons I couldn't get published was because I was an engineer, not an MD. So I finally, in desperation, went to medical school in order to get an MD after my name so I could be published. And I've been practicing medicine since 1983, close to 31 years. I've treated several thousand patients, mostly teaching them how to take care of themselves. And that's what I'm trying to do for you right now. Thanks for listening and watching, and we shall return with episode 2. Please get my book, Dr. Bernstein's Diabetes Solution. It's available at virtually every internet bookstore and many local bookstores. It contains much more information than these lectures that I'm giving you, and really is essential if you want to keep your blood sugars normal, as I do.